Chapter 6. Listening. Septimus's month in the great chamber of alchemy was not as interesting as he had hoped. After the initial excitement of removing the sand, which he managed in 3 days by fixing up a siphoning arrangement that drew the sand out through the labyrinth, scouring it clean as it went, and sending the sand into the underflow pool, Septimus spent his time cleaning, unpacking, and doing more cleaning. Marcellus was forever disappearing. Checking things, apprentice. And Septimus spent a lot of time on his own. He began to count down the days to his return to the wizard tower. Marcellus's disappearances were, of course, when he was tending the fire. It was going well, but he dared not leave it for too long. The water flow was good. He had been a little anxious about dumping the sand in the underflow pool, but it was deep enough to take it. His main concern now was venting the cauldron heat, which was growing daily. Toward the end of Septimus's month, Marcellus took a reluctant decision to open 4 more vents. He chose their positions carefully and hoped that no one would notice. On a beautiful bright dawn 2 days before the end of his month with Marcellus, Septimus was trudging to work, heading for the entrance to the great chamber that Marcellus had recently opened. His journey took him past the palace and the bizarre collection of snow sculptures that were being created on the lawns in front. He stopped for a moment to look at the new ones, and then reluctantly set off. It was going to be another beautiful day, but he would spend it underground, in candlelight, and it would be dark by the time he returned. On the other side of the palace, Jenna was drawing back the curtains from her bedroom window. She saw the sun climbing over the snow-covered hills in the distance, the pinky-green streaks of cloud low in the sky, and the sparkling orange glints of light on the shining black surface of the river. It was beautiful, but it was cold. Jenna shivered. She was not surprised to see ice frosting the windows, but it was now more than 4 weeks into the big freeze, and a deep chill pervaded everything. She dressed quickly in her winter robes, and wrapping herself in her fur-lined cloak, was out of her bedroom fast. The ghost of Sir Hereward, who guarded her bedroom door, woke with a start. A ghostly, "Good morning, princess," followed Jenna as she strode briskly down the corridor. "Morning, Sir Hereward," she called back over her shoulder, and disappeared around the corner. Sir Hereward shook his head. The living were always in such a hurry, he thought. The ghost performed an old-fashioned military about-turn, and began a slow march down to the palace doors, where, once the princess had left her room, he now spent his days on guard. Downstairs, Jenna grabbed a few leftovers from the supper table, pulled her red winter fur-lined cloak tighter around herself, and headed out, winding her way through the assortment of snow sculptures, stopping briefly to admire her favorites. As she drew near the palace gate, Jenna saw 2 large, ungainly figures loitering on either side. She approached cautiously, wondering who they might be. And then she remembered. It was the day of the annual castle snowman competition. She pushed open the gate and walked out through 2 guard snowmen. "Happy Snowman Day, Princess," one of the snowmen said. Jenna jumped in surprise. Then she saw the bob of a red bobble hat, followed by the cheeky grin of a small boy peering from behind the bulk of the snowman. Perched on the shoulders of a much taller friend, he was in the process of putting the finishing touches to his snowman. "Happy Snowman Day," Jenna replied, smiling in return. "He's good," she said, pointing at the snowman. The boys laughed. "We're going to win." "Good luck." Jenna walked off into Wizard Way, her fur-lined boots pressing the fresh snow beneath. With her red cloak standing out against the more sober colors of most people's winter robes, Jenna was easy to spot as she made her way along the freshly cleared path that ran beside the shops. She passed by a motley assortment of snowmen. Larry's Dead Languages sported a surprisingly upbeat snowman with a large melon-slice grin and Larry's favorite scarf. Jenna suspected that once Larry saw it, both the scarf and the grin would rapidly vanish. Wizard Sandwiches boasted an eye-aching snowman made from rainbow-colored snow, and outside Sandra's Palace of Pets was a disconcertingly giant rabbit, complete with a supersized carrot. Jenna walked slowly on past a trio of small printing shops, each with an identical little snowman wearing a printer's apron and reading a book. As she neared the wizard tower, she saw a familiar figure heading toward the great arch. He was wearing the still, to Jenna, unfamiliar dark blue robes of the chief hermetic scribe, and had a long metal cylinder tucked under his arm. "Hey, Beetle," she called, picking up speed. The chief hermetic scribe turned and waved, then waited for Jenna to catch up. "Hello," puffed Jenna. "How's it going?" Beetle smiled. "Good," he said. "Really good. And you?" "Great. Yes, fine, thanks." Jenna regarded Beetle shyly. He seemed so very different in his official robes. It was hard to believe this was the same Beetle who had been working for the irascible Larry not so very long ago. He seemed taller, older, and his brown eyes regarded her with an expression that was strangely distant. Beetle used to look so happy to see her, thought Jenna, but now that he was chief hermetic scribe he was much more reserved. She wasn't sure if she liked that. The gold bands on the sleeves of Beetle's robes glittered as he raised his free arm to shield his eyes against the bright morning sun, and then, in a happily familiar gesture, run his hand through his unruly black hair. Jenna smiled. "Better get going. Got to meet Marcia in—" Beetle looked at his time, please. 5 minutes and 42 seconds precisely. Jenna looked horrified. Beetle broke into a broad smile. "Gotcha," he said. "Oh, you pig," said Jenna, laughing, happy to see a glimpse of the old Beetle. "For a horrible moment I thought you'd turn into Jilly Jin." "Nope, not yet, anyway." So how are you? I haven't seen you for ages. Gosh, Simon's wedding, I suppose. Are you busy? Well, I guess you must be." The old Beetle disappeared, and the chief hermetic scribe looked at his timepiece. "I'm sorry, Princess Jenna, I really must go. Stuff to do and all that." Jenna could see that Beetle was longing to be off. She felt as if she was being a nuisance, and that wasn't good. Jenna had an uncomfortable sense that she had once made Beetle feel just like she was feeling now. "Oh, yes, of course," she said. "Well, I'll see you around then. Have a nice day." "You too." With that, the chief hermetic scribe strode off, his long blue robes brushing the snow, leaving a softly flattened wake behind them. Jenna watched Beetle walk into the shadows of the lapis lazuli-lined great arch, and disappeared into his new unknown world. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the melancholy that had settled on her, and walked on toward the gap between the last two houses on Wizard Way. Here she made a left-hand turn into a snow-filled alleyway, which led to the castle wall. The alley was about a foot deep in snow, which Jenna waded slowly through. She was in no hurry to get where she was going. But soon enough Jenna reached a flight of stone steps that led up to the path that ran along the top of the castle walls. Just behind the battlements, kicking newly fallen snow away so that she could see where the steps were, Jenna climbed up and found herself standing on a wide, flat, snow-covered path which bore traces of footsteps blurred with snow from the previous night's fall. Jenna stopped at the top of the steps and looked around. She loved this part of the castle. Not many people chose to walk along the walls. It had been forbidden during the rule of the custodians in the bad old days, as they were now known, and many people still believe that only the extraordinary wizard and the princess were allowed to use the path. Jenna was happy with that. It was one of the few places in the castle where she could wander without feeling she was public property. The battlements were low at this point, and Jenna could easily see over them. She looked across the iced-up moat to the tall trees on the opposite bank, the outriders of the forest. Their branches were laden with snow, thick and stark against the black bark of their trunks. Jenna thought of her 4 Forest Heap brothers. She was so glad that Sarah had persuaded them to stay in the castle for the big freeze. She shivered. Even with a campfire burning day and night, even with all the smelly furs they wore, they must have been so cold in the forest. Jenna pulled her cloak closely around her and set off slowly along the path, following the tracks she had made the day before, and the days before that. The path on top of the castle walls followed the curve of the moat. The moat slowly folded in toward her, turning always a little to the right, like the python in the Moran marshes. On her right-hand side, the path was bounded by the back walls of typical tall, narrow castle houses, which regularly gave way to unnerving sheer drops that could rapidly deliver the unwary walker to an alleyway 20 feet below. At these points she kept close to the battlements and took care not to look down. Jenna passed softly and unknowingly over the ancient hole in the wall tavern, a popular meeting place for ghosts that was hollowed out in the wall below, and approached a bend in the path. She rounded it, and suddenly, laid out below, she saw Janet Martin's boatyard, which was now no more than a collection of boat-shaped snowy mounds. Jenna walked on, following her old snow-covered footsteps, until she came to a widening of the wall, open like a plateau, where her footprints ended in a circle of well-trodden snow. She stopped for a moment and glanced around. The open space was deserted, as it always was, and yet, as she walked slowly forward, Jenna could not shake off the feeling that she was pushing through a crowd. And she was. A crowd of ghostly queens, princesses, and princesses in waiting were waiting anxiously for her. With each careful step that Jenna took, the ghosts of her grandmothers, great-grandmothers, aunts, and great-aunts fell back to avoid being passed through. Ghostly violet eyes followed their descendants as she made her way slowly to an icy spot in the middle of the space from which the snow had been scraped away. Jenna stopped, shivered, looked around once more, then took a few steps across to the battlement at the edge of the wall. She leaned over and looked down to check she was in the right place, just in case she had got it wrong. Some 6 feet below she saw a burnished gold disc set into the wall. Jenna stood back from the battlements and sighed. She was in the right place. Of course she was. The crowd of royal ghosts parted as she returned to the icy spot, kneeled down, and began to unlace her fur-lined winter boots. High up in one of the houses set back from the path, Jenna added one more to her audience, a small boy. He peered out of an attic window and saw the princess, again. Soon he was joined by his mother and grandmother. Noses pressed against the glass, they watched the princess take off her boots and a pair of furry purple socks, then stand barefoot on the cold stones. "See, I told you she did that," whispered the little boy. "Oh dear," whispered the mother. "I do hope she's not going to be a crazy one like that Datchet." "Shh!" scolded the grandmother. "She'll hear you." "Of course she won't," retorted the mother. But down in the crowd of ghosts, the ghost of Queen Datchet III did hear. It is a fact that those who have been a little paranoid in life develop a wonderful ability in ghosthood to hear their name mentioned many miles away. But Jenna heard nothing, neither the mother in the attic, nor the sound she longed to hear, the thrum, thrum, thrum of the dragon boat's slow but steady heartbeat, pulsing through the stone and the soles of her feet as it always had, until the last few days. Jenna willed herself to feel that unmistakable thump. She thought of the dragon boat lying beneath the path, immured in her lapis lazuli dragon house. She remembered the last time she had seen the dragon boat. In her mind's eye, she could still see the great green dragon head resting on the marble walkway that ran along both sides of the barrel-vaulted dragon house, and the thick dragon tail coiled like a massive green rope, laid on the marble ledge that ran along the back wall. Jenna remembered how perfect the boat had looked, so beautifully repaired by Janet Martin, and yet how limp and lifeless the dragon had been. And then Jenna thought about how Aunt Zelda had still not let her have the transubstantiate triple bowls so that she could use the revive she had gotten from Rhoda Pye so long ago. A wave of exasperation washed over her, but Jenna pushed the bad feelings aside, took a deep breath, and emptied her mind of everything except what she could feel through the soles of her feet. She stood stone still, silent, immersed, but once again she could feel nothing at all. In the attic room the 3 watchers fell silent. The grandmother knew what the princess was waiting for. She had not lived above the dragon house without thinking about the beautiful dragon that lay beneath, and especially on long cold winter nights, wondering if the creature was still alive, and that was exactly what Jenna was wondering now. The ice numbed Jenna's feet, but still she waited for a small thrum of hope. A sudden gust of bitter wind blew a flurry of snow off the battlements. It sprinkled her bluish toes with icy white frosting, and Jenna realized that her feet had gone numb. There was no hope of feeling anything now. The wind, or something, brought tears to her eyes. Slowly she kneeled down, pulled on her furry socks and her brown leather boots. She stood up, irresolute for a moment, and then, watched by the family far above, and the ghosts of 54 queens, princesses, and princesses in waiting, she began to retrace her snowy footsteps. The small boy watched Jenna go. "She looks sad, Grandma," he whispered. The grandmother watched Jenna walking slowly back along the path, her red cloak a splash of color against the monochrome whites and grays of the snow-covered walls, and the dark moat and wintry trees beyond. "Yes, she does," the grandmother agreed. "It is not good for the princess to be so sad."